Don Wallace. I'm a writer and a contributing editor of Honolulu Magazine. And for years, they've allowed me to fill their pages and website with 150 or more reviews and Q&As with authors. I'd like to thank my editor and creative director, Christy Young, and our company AIO for that, which is pretty important to our book scene. And I'd like to thank Roger Jelinek and the Hawaii Book and Music Festival for persevering, for daring to connect us. And the University of Hawaii has done a big move in joining as a partner, and they're going to grow this into a very robust, game-changing way to do book conferences, both virtual and in person next year. So mahalo for them. Today we have two fascinating lives, outsized lives, of Leonard Bernstein and Ben Hecht. They resonate strongly with today's mix of art and politics, gender issues, sexuality, and some bad behavior. The authors are themselves very well behaved. No, seriously, I think they're both very graceful and evocative writers, Mari Yoshihara and Julian Gorbach. So we'll start with Mari, her book, Dearest Lenny, Letters from Japan and the Making of the World Maestro. Lenny is Leonard Bernstein, of course. Mari is professor and chair of American Studies at UH Mānoa. She's the author of Embracing the East, White Women and American Orientalism. Also, Musicians from a Different World, Asians and Asian Americans in Classical Music. She's the editor of the American Quarterly from the Johns Hopkins University, the Journal of American Studies. And she's a classical musician herself, which is what makes her understanding of Leonard Bernstein and his time so comprehensive and powerful. And on my left, we have Julian Gorbach in his book, The Notorious Ben Hecht. Who was Ben Hecht? He helped create our modern media world, including social. He's a not so Jewish kid, grows up in Racine, Wisconsin. He lights up the world and the whole 20th century with his words. He goes to Chicago as a newsboy in the yellow journalism days. He becomes a Broadway sensation with The Front Page, still the best work about a newspaper life. I speak as a former newsman. He creates the gangster movie with writing Scarface, 1932, dozens of other name-check movies. He writes a screenplay in 12 hours once. He's so prolific. He fights American anti-Semitism and world anti-Semitism as World War II looms. And after the war, he turns himself into a gun runner to Israel. So you can see the sparks coming off his fingers. And the way Julian writes about him is truly visceral and it's exciting. Julian is a Boston native, an assistant professor in the School of Communications at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And his book is published by Purdue University Press. It earned the National Jewish Book Award Finalist Prize for Best Biography. I think we're just going to let Julian tell us about Ben Hecht, and I'll be throwing in a few questions. And you can put your questions as the audience into the chat bar, and there's also a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So hang on, here comes the Notorious Ben Hecht.
Hi, everybody. So let me pull up my slides here. And hoping everybody can see both me and my my slides. Let me go ahead and tell you about my book. Let's see. Here's the cover. And Don did an excellent job of kind of giving you a real thumbnail sketch of who Ben Hecht is, which is great because we're trying to move relatively efficiently in what we talk about. And so that way I won't have to kind of give a whole detailed biography, but yeah, just to give you an idea of the arc. The biography itself, I really wanted to look at, I understood that Hecht had played this role in history and that he was a very controversial figure and also had these different roles in his profession. Changing from journalist to screenwriter to political activist to memoirist, and that there was all this controversy surrounding both his writing and his acts. And so one of the things as I dug deeper into it was this real question of what was this controversy about, and what could it tell us? And at the heart of that was this question of, it turned out, this question of how did this person see the world, and what can that maybe tell us about the world we live in today? So as Don very helpfully mentioned, Hecht was considered, he had the name the Shakespeare of Hollywood. He contributed to over 140 films, and he wrote during the golden era of Hollywood, during the 1930s and onward, at a time when sound films were first introduced and when it was still possible to invent movie genres. So yes, he wrote. He's credited with inventing the gangster film, and that really came to the fore with his 1932 blockbuster Scarface. But his first gangster film actually was a silent one, and it's considered really the first gangster movie and successful. And it was called Underworld. And he wrote other great films like Gone with the Wind, Notorious with Hitchcock, and Front Page was a classic, first on the Broadway stage, as Don mentioned, but then it's been remade into a film 4 times. It's been revived on Broadway 4 times as well. So it's a film about newspapers that's been made and remade again and again. Probably the greatest version is His Girl Friday, which was a romantic comedy that was made in 1941. So in addition, though, Hecht was not just a Hollywood writer, but a Hollywood rebel. The Hollywood studios were really reluctant to make films about the Nazi persecution of the Jews, even though many of the Hollywood studio bosses were Jews themselves. And as Hecht put it, he turned into a Jew in 1939. It was the Nazi murder of the Jews that really woke up his Jewish activism in him. And so what he did was, seeing the emergency of the Holocaust beginning to unfold. I mean, he had written a really uncanny visionary story called The Little Candle, in which he very vividly described the Holocaust in a 1939 story when this was really beyond belief for most people of the world. But he saw this coming, and so he launched this massive multifaceted publicity campaign, which involved ads in newspapers, celebrity pageants, speeches, fundraising, political lobbying. So he really used his talents as a media figure, as one of, at that point, the highest paid writer in Hollywood, to kind of launch this public relations campaign. And so one of the things that I say about Hecht is that he was a legend as a Hollywood screenwriter, but he's also unique as a writer in that he played this important role in history. And to be specific, what he really did was he woke people up to the final solution to the Jewish question, which was the news that the Nazis had a plan to exterminate all the Jews of Europe. And so there was what he called a race against death, to put pressure on Roosevelt and Churchill to mobilize an Allied plan to rescue the Jews. He put on this massive Madison Square Garden pageant called We Will Never Die in 1943. But unfortunately, the plans to save the Jews obviously failed because the politics got in the way. And so that kind of radicalized Hecht, and he ended up being involved in the fight over establishing a Jewish state, beginning with the effort to kind of break the British blockade that stopped Jewish Holocaust survivors from coming to Palestine after the war. And one of the ways he did that was he wanted to fund the armed revolt of the Irgun that was actually attacking the British troops that were then occupying Palestine. But in the process, he recruited a then unknown 19-year-old named Marlon Brando to star in a play about establishing a Jewish state, a kind of a radical militant play called A Flag is Born. And the militancy of that really came to its fore with the controversy that he did around this time, which was a full-page ad in a lot of newspapers around the country, which basically said, it was headlined to the terrorists of Palestine, to the Jewish terrorists of Palestine. And he basically said, every time you blow up a British train or kill British troops, the Jews of America make a holiday in their hearts, which is just a shocking thing to say in America in the 40s, right after the war. But you know, he suffered a lot of repercussions because of that. But he wasn't done radicalizing at that point. Here was a man who started out as a Chicago newspaper reporter, ended up inventing the gangster movie. And in 1947, he ended up partnering with a real gangster, the Jewish gangster Mickey Cohen, to finance and smuggle weapons to Palestine in the fight for a Jewish state. So all this sort of raises the question of how did this guy who started out appealing for a humanitarian rescue become you know, so militant and ally himself with gangsters and write this appeal to terrorists? What sort of explains the way he was looking at things? And what I found was that, you know, for him, this really came down to his view of human nature and a question of, is man good or evil? And he really had a dark view of that, particularly with the rise of Nazism. He saw that as an affirmation that there was really something very dark and dangerous about something in the soul of man, as he, in the phrase that he used again and again.
Now, it may seem a leap suddenly to go to a great maestro, a composer, probably the greatest and most populist of the second half of, you know, the 20th century, Leonard Bernstein. But in fact, Leonard Bernstein was a tremendous activist, and he was a tremendous soul and human spirit, very much like Hecht. He was Jewish, but he was fiery about it, but he was much more, had a wider aperture for his concerns, which included anti-nuclear and peace involvement, which he was very, very prominent. It's hard almost to overstate how in those 60s and 70s, he was right up there with Dr. Spock and everyone. And one key to that is he had a very deep relationship with Japan, which he helped open to classical music. And that's the subject of Mari Yoshihara's book, Dearest Lenny, Letters from Japan and the Making of the World Maestro. In the post-war era, Bernstein was the protean power source of American music, not just classical. Broadway, West Side Story, other works. But he was also a democratizer. He was a popularizer. He carried the torch for classical music way beyond, he went down from the elites and captured the common viewer. And as Mari will no doubt tell us, he's part of a technological revolution. The long playing album, the television appearance of music. And her book focuses on the opening up of Japan to Western music through the chronicling two Japanese fans, literally pen pals, who write him a letter. And one's a girl who plays classical music and is a devoted writer of letters. And the other is a Japanese insurance man. Now, it seems like, you know, stars get letters every day, but in the beginning, Lenny responded. He wrote back. He was touched by their very personal sentiments. And Mari's book is kind of amazing because we think it's like a fan's notes. It's kind of, okay, there's an element of, you know, star worship, and it'll reach an inevitable end, and then it will peter out. But there's a remarkable third act for both her two characters. And that third act I'll leave to her to reveal, but I'll say that she plays a pair of aces very skillfully and delivers a portrait of the growth of two humble individuals through their contact with the giant of modern classical music. And you come out loving all three of these characters for who they were, for what they did, and for their ability to reach beyond the barriers of class and nationality, and particularly star and fan. So Mari, thank you. Here we come.
Thank you, Don. That's a wonderful introduction. So as Don just told you, my book, Dearest Lenny, Letters from Japan and the Making of the World Maestro, is really a story of love. So the book revolves around Leonard Bernstein. He was born in 1918, so the end of World War I, and he died in 1990 at the end of the Cold War. So in many ways, he was a man who really symbolized the world of the 20th century. And he was a tremendously multi-talented man as a composer, conductor, pianist, pedagogue. He was also a very charming and charismatic media personality who, as Don said, brought the wonders of classical music far beyond the walls of the concert hall. He was also a committed political activist on various causes, ranging from civil rights, nuclear disarmament, and AIDS research later in his life. He had quite a colorful and complex personal life, as he had a happy family life with his wife and 3 children, but also was gay and had a number of relationships with men throughout his life. Now, my work on this book started in the summer of 2013, when I was looking through some stuff in the Leonard Bernstein collection at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Now, this collection, as it turns out, is huge. It's one of the largest archival collection devoted to any individual artist anywhere in the world, consisting of over 1,700 boxes, 400,000 items. And while I was browsing through the collection's finding aid, I came across 2 names of Japanese individuals that I didn't recognize. One is Kazuko Amano, or Kazuko Ueno is her maiden name, and the other is Kunihiko Hashimoto. And according to the finding aid, both of them had apparently written lots and lots of letters to Bernstein. So just out of curiosity, to find out who these people were, I requested to see these letters. When these boxes of letters came and I started reading the letters was when I ditched my original research project, and that was the beginning of my extraordinary journey that led to the making of Dearest Lenny. So I'll just tell you a very abbreviated version of the story of these 2 individuals. Kazuko Amano was born in Japan in 1929 and spent her childhood in Paris because of her father's job as a corporate executive. And there she was a piano student at the Paris Conservatory. And the political situation forced the family to leave Europe, and Kazuko spent her teenage years in wartime Japan. And then at the end, after the war, when she was 18 years old, she came across a short essay written by a young composer named Leonard Bernstein in a music magazine she was browsing through at a library in Tokyo. And she was very impressed by the deep humanistic philosophy that was evident in the essay. And Kazuko was convinced that this young conductor would soon become a great artist. And she decided to write a fan letter. She timed it to arrive around his birthday on August 25th, 1947. And then, about a year later, she unexpectedly received a letter from Bernstein, accompanied by a photograph with his signature. And thus began this very precious epistolary relationship between young Kazuko Ueno and Leonard Bernstein. Let me go to, are you seeing the letters now, the image? I hope. So in the subsequent years, Kazuko wrote many, many letters to Bernstein in her beautiful penmanship on carefully selected stationery, conveying her deep admiration and understanding of music that she heard through recordings. And often she would also report to Bernstein about the reception of his music in Japan. As she went through the many different stages of her life, marriage to man Reiji Amano, having and raising 2 children, frequent relocation from one city to another because of her husband's job, Kazuko followed Bernstein's rise as an American icon and a world maestro. And her love and devotion to the maestro occupied a central part of her heart and mind. Her letters convey a complex mix of emotions, including a girlish fandom for a star, maybe even a tinge of romantic attraction, but also a realistic and intelligent understanding of her place, and most importantly, the admiration for a great artist. The second character is Kunihiko Hashimoto. Kunihiko Hashimoto met Bernstein in the summer of 1979, on the last day of Bernstein's Japan tour, again with the New York Philharmonic. And the 2 men spent the night together. After seeing Bernstein off at the airport, Hashimoto wrote his first love letter. It's a passionate, tender, beautiful letter that conveys how deeply this young man, he was young enough to be Bernstein's son, fell in love with the maestro. But the letter also gives insight to the sensitive, intelligent, sincere man that Hashimoto was. This was not simply a young man's crush on this charismatic maestro. Apparently, Bernstein also felt a deep connection with Maestro and made him promise that he would write to him at least once a week. Hashimoto not only kept his promise, in subsequent weeks and months, he wrote to Bernstein almost on a daily basis, pages and pages at a time, conveying his deep love and almost desperate yearning to be with him. Per Bernstein's invitation, Hashimoto spent a week with the maestro in Europe in August of 1979, and again a year and a half later. Through these encounters, Hashimoto's love for Bernstein grew into something much greater than romantic and sexual attraction, into awe and worship for a great being that he wished to serve in any way he could. Now, when Hashimoto first met Bernstein, as Don mentioned, he was a businessman working for an insurance company. So he was not at all a man of fame and fortune, the kind of people that Bernstein normally associated with. But upon meeting Bernstein, Hashimoto's desire to devote his career to his true passion was again ignited. And a few years later, he left the insurance business and entered the world of the performing arts himself. He passed a very competitive audition for Japan's most prestigious musical theater company and began touring all over Japan. He sent many postcards to Bernstein from his tour destinations, excited about his new career, but with a clear understanding of the challenges ahead and resolute determination for achieving his creative aspirations. Then, in 1984, Hashimoto's desire to serve his beloved maestro in any way possible was realized. He was invited by Amberson Enterprises, which was a company that was running Bernstein's business, to serve as the maestro's Japan representative. In this new role, Hashimoto played a central role in organizing some of the most important projects in Bernstein's late career. In 1985, on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the atomic bombing in Hiroshima, Bernstein performed the Hiroshima Peace Concert with the European Community Youth Orchestra. He was a decades-long and very committed advocate for nuclear disarmament, and he had profound artistic, political, and moral investment in this project. And Hashimoto played an indispensable role in realizing the maestro's goal. Just a month later, Hashimoto also assisted in Bernstein's Japan tour with the Israel Philharmonic, the orchestra to which the maestro had deep, lifelong commitment. So, he was very strongly Jewish identified, and he was a strong supporter of both the state of Israel, especially the Israel Philharmonic, which he conducted for free throughout his career. So he had very strong ties with the Israel Philharmonic. And then finally, in the summer of 1990, the Pacific Music Festival was inaugurated in the northern city of Sapporo, Japan. Bernstein had always loved teaching, but later in his career, he directed special efforts into working with young musicians. Then this festival brought together 123 young musicians from 18 countries, mostly from the Pacific and Asia region, to study and perform with Bernstein in the form similar to the Tanglewood Music Festival in Massachusetts. By this time, Hashimoto had actually relocated to Sydney, Australia, but he was flown in to assist in all aspects of the maestro's work and the execution of this event throughout the festival. Now, after the 2.5 weeks in Sapporo, Bernstein was found collapsed on the hotel floor in Tokyo. So the remaining performances were canceled, and he was immediately flown home to New York. He announced his retirement from conducting a few months later, and he passed away on October 14th, 1990. So actually, this past week was the 30th anniversary of Bernstein's passing. So this means that one of the most important projects in Bernstein's late career took place in Japan, and Hashimoto was indispensable to its realization. Of course, Bernstein's death was devastating for both Amano and Hashimoto, but their devotion did not end with his passing. Amano remained a loyal supporter and fan of the Pacific Music Festival and traveled to Sapporo every summer. Hashimoto also remained involved in the festival, but now as a performing arts in his own right. He was asked to translate the libretto for Bernstein's opera Candide, which premiered in Japan at the 5th anniversary of the Pacific Music Festival. As also at the festival, he also organized and hosted a concert for young audiences, which was modeled after Bernstein's Young People's Concert series. So in these ways, the two Japanese individuals who dearly loved Bernstein in their own ways carried on the maestro's legacy and continue to do so 30 years later. So Dearest Lenny is a story of how these very unlikely relationships across nations, cultures, age, and status were enabled by art and music, and the book depicts the world that created such relationships. There's a lot more to be said about the book, but I'll just end here and open up for a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really great. And it's a wonderful story. And one thing that came to my mind for both authors and both subjects, this is a book kind of about the common touch. Kamae, do you think Kazuko and Kuni supplied realness to Bernstein in a way?
Yeah, I mean, Bernstein was really an international superstar, right? And he had,
Right.
if you look at the archives, I mean, there are like literally thousands and thousands of fan letters, and of course, I haven't read all of them. But I think the reason, especially in case of Amano, whom he didn't meet in person for 14 years of their initial friendship, right? So why did he bother to write back to this one young, unknown Japanese woman? Is, I think it's an intriguing question. And this actually relates to Julian's work, because she wrote the first fan letter in 1947. I'm assuming that Bernstein didn't receive her letter right away, because that was a time when Bernstein was touring the Middle East for the first time. That was in the middle of the war, 47, 48, and he was conducting these orchestras consisting of Holocaust survivors. So he was witnessing, the devastation of the Holocaust, but also the War of Independence. And he had very strong, attachment to the state of Israel and what became Israel Philharmonic. And I think he was really a world citizen throughout his life, but his special commitment to war and peace, and his understanding of what that all means in a very real sense, made him more particularly sensitive to receiving a letter from this young woman from Japan, which had been, until not that long ago, until 2 years ago, was the United States' mortal enemy. So I think her very sincere, an intelligent, articulate letter touched Bernstein, especially.
And I was going to say, Julian, where this connected for me was not only the reaching out that Hecht did to Mickey Cohen, the gangster, when, of course, in his early years in your book, you say Ben Hecht preferred the company of thieves and murderers and gangsters than when he was in Chicago as a reporter. That was his normal. It was floozies and flappers and that wonderful period. But also a story that really affected me about the book is he had a friend, a poet named Bodenheimer. And the story about Bodenheimer, I think you can tell, but Hecht is a big success, but they started out together. Why don't you pick it up from there?
So just talk about that relationship with Bodenheim.
Well, just how he turned to him and helped him at that crucial point.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I actually, in order to revise the book, I had to cut out, I mean, in a way, the original, you look at my dissertation, the original draft, it was about Hecht's two friendships with these two men, one a poet and the other a gangster. And the issue is just, in terms of really getting a tight book, I ended up cutting a whole chapter about Mickey Cohen out, which was like 20 pages long, just about Mickey Cohen's adventures in Los Angeles. And I ended up cutting, both were just fascinating figures in themselves and have been the subject of biographies themselves. But I ended up cutting out a chapter about Bodenheim. And I guess the arc of it, which is really fascinating, is that Hecht and Bodenheim were part of probably the most important movement in American letters that ever happened, which was the Chicago literary Renaissance. And this was just a really a handful of writers who ended up, out of their group during the pre-war and then the war, World War I era, published. It was Margaret Anderson's publication, The Little Review, which introduced Americans, and really introduced in a lot of ways the world, to T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and most famously, Ernest Hemingway's first stories were published there. Just basically enough to fill up the 20th century and beyond's syllabus in English classes. And most famously, she serialized Ulysses, which led to the huge court case. So they were part of this. Hecht and Bodenheim were part of this, as very young men, 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, part of this incredibly powerful but small literary scene. And they were different than anyone else in the scene in that everyone else in the scene embraced socialism and these sort of collectivist ideas and unionism and started taking to the streets during the pre-war and Great War era with this. And that all kind of came to a head. And Hecht and Bodenheim were the cynics. And so they had a very unique, almost like twin relationship because they were much more art for art's sake and involved in that way. But they were also very caustic, sarcastic figures themselves. And so they ended up publishing this lampoon, which was kind of a template for alternative weeklies that emerged in the 60s and 70s and beyond, called the Chicago Literary Times, where all these iconic figures that we're talking about, F. Scott Fitzgerald, not James Joyce so much, but just so many of the other figures. They liked Joyce, but so many of the other figures, they would take these people who are literary giants to us now, and in the 20s, at the time when these guys were coming out, they would ridicule them viciously and lampoon them and stuff in the Chicago Literary Times in a quite witty way. And eventually, this culminated with Hecht writing a book lampooning Bodenheim in a way that Bodenheim was offended by, and Bodenheim writing a book that was sort of bitter, that attacked, that counterpunched on Hecht, and they had like kind of a falling out. And at that point, Bodenheim had this insane arc as a literary celebrity in the jazz age of Chicago, where he ended up befriending a 19, 20-year-old that inherited millions. The kid had been a soda jerk and a poet and ended up getting bequeathed this estate. And so he moved to New York and partnered with Bodenheim, and they had this wild tour of jazz age New York in the 20s. And there was this string of women that fell in love with Bodenheim and committed suicide. And he was this tabloid figure. And it culminated with the Depression, the crash. And with the crash and with the fallout of his friendship with Hecht, Bodenheim ended up going from a literary celebrity who was in the company of Ezra Pound and all of these figures, T.S. Eliot, to being homeless. And Hecht and Bodenheim didn't talk for like 10 years. They had fallen out because of the books they'd written about each other and the strains in their relationship. And when they met again, 10 years later in 1940, Hecht was the highest paid writer in the world, basically. He was the top paid screenwriter of the world. And Bodenheim was living on the streets and couldn't get published to get arrested, and was walking around when Hecht met him on a blizzard day with a suitcase full of his poems that he couldn't publish. And so Hecht had brought him home to the warmth of his house in New York and said, let's make a deal. If you just do a page of writing every week, if you keep going, I will pay you, every week. I will give you a check to keep you going and to keep you with a roof over your head. And so for years, Bodenheim would write these letters and Hecht would send him $30 or $40. And the letters are collected in the Hecht archive. And they're this kind of astonishing sort of pre-beatnik story of New York in the 40s, with a lot of really incisive commentary, and a really talented writer, and kind of did this like cultural journalism in these letters to Hecht that make this a whole fascinating documentary record itself. I guess I'm sort of inspired by Marie's
Yeah.
project, and maybe, you know, that could be a spin-off project. And a lot of people didn't like the Bodenheim story, maybe for the same reasons, Don, that it appealed to you, because to me, I've known so many artists who, you know, were just on that line between artist and misfit and failure. And are they a rebel, or are they someone who's just unable to fit into society? I grew up, you know, I went to art school, and I knew, you know, and I've felt that way a lot myself, where, you know, you're beating your head against the wall. Some people can adapt. Hecht was amazing at being able to adapt from newspaper to screenwriting to all these popular forms of arts. Bodenheim, for all of his talents, couldn't change. To Hecht, he was a fascinating character because he was a true artist. He was unable to compromise in any kind of way. But that also raised the question, well, was he just crazy? And to me, that's a fascinating story.
Right.
Other people, to a lot of people, they don't relate, they don't understand that story, and they don't like a story of failure and misery, which is a lot of what, you know, Bodenheim ended up murdered in a, you know, in the Bowery, by a crazy homeless person, stabbed.
But you see, by today's standards, that's a happy ending, you know. And let me point out that the parallels between your two books are, they couldn't be more different. Leonard Bernstein was polished and suave and warm, and Ben Hecht was shooting fire out of his fingertips, and yet they both had a deep humanity. And so, Mari, I was thinking about you as a researcher. You stumbled upon the letters, you start reading them without a clue of the transformations of their lives. At what point did you decide to do a book?
I decided to do a book, like, really when I read these two people's letters. I was working on a completely different project about the cultural policy during the Cold War era, and I went to the Bernstein collection specifically to look at the stuff related to the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, because when it opened in 1971, Bernstein's this sort of theatrical piece Mass premiered the center, partly because Bernstein was a close family friend of the Kennedys. So I was interested in that particular aspect of it. But then once I started looking at the collection, it's just so huge. And then I really, you know, by accident, stumbled upon these letters. I just looked them up simply because I was curious about these two Japanese names. I knew that Bernstein had close connection to people like Seiji Ozawa, the conductor, or Toru Takemitsu, the composer. But these two names I didn't recognize. And so just really out of curiosity as to who they were, I looked at the letters. And so that's when I thought this is a great human interest story. But initially I didn't, that's when I were only mostly reading these letters themselves. But then the more I kept doing the research, I realized that it's much more. It's a very moving human interest story too, but it's also much more than that, right? Bernstein was very much a product of an influencer of the 20th century, and there are all these things that, for one thing, the context in which these two Japanese individuals came to have such an intimate relationship with Bernstein, the international superstar, has a lot to do with the political and economic context of U.S.-Japan relations in the second half of the 20th century.